Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're putting on our objective researcher hats to look into a 60-year-old unsolved mystery that has honestly baffled people for decades. We're talking about the Dyatlov Pass Incident. We're going to evaluate the raw data, shut out all the noise, and see exactly how modern slope failure models in science finally cracked a case that seemed literally impossible to solve.
Okay, let's dive into this by looking at the raw data right off the bat. In early 1959, 9 highly experienced hikers journeyed into the northern Urals. They were later found dead on the slopes of Kholat Syakho. But, it wasn't just the fact that they died, it was how they were found. The evidence showed they had literally cut their way out of their own tent from the inside and then fled into a howling blizzard, many without proper footwear or warm clothing. It's just a bizarre scene. So when the authorities closed the initial case back then, this was their official conclusion, an unknown compelling force. I mean, talk about incredibly vague, right? Because there were no survivors, no obvious suspects, and absolutely no signs of a violent struggle, this highly ambiguous statement essentially birthed a legendary mystery. It just left this massive investigative void that really cried out for a rigorous scientific review.
Section 1. Evaluating bizarre existing theories.
As researchers, we know that without grounded physical data, amateur detectives and speculators just get desperate. And that's exactly what happened here. Failed hypotheses rushed in to fill the void, ranging from animal attacks or even a Yeti to UFOs specifically targeting the hikers. Some folks pointed to Soviet secret weapons or a massive military cover-up. Others thought romantic tensions within the group sparked a deadly fight, or maybe temporary insanity caused by drug abuse or infrasound drove him out into the cold. But we have to impartially recognize these for what they are. They're just desperate attempts to make sense of the nonsensical. Section 2. The avalanche problem.
So the crucial point here is that an avalanche makes perfect logical sense. Snow sliding towards them completely explains why they'd panic, slash the tent, and run. But the hard physical evidence told a totally different story. Searchers found the tent torn, but it wasn't buried like it would be in a typical snowslide. Plus, the slope was only 22 to 30 degrees, which is way too shallow for a typical avalanche. Furthermore, 3 victims had severe blunt force injuries, which was definitely not your typical avalanche suffocation. And perhaps the most confusing part? The tent was pitched roughly 9 hours before they actually fled. A 9-hour delay between destabilizing the snow and the avalanche happening? It just didn't add up for investigators at the time.
Section 3. A cinematic scientific breakthrough. And the breakthrough for all of this started in the most unexpected place. Avalanche researcher Johann Gaum watched Disney's 2013 animated film Frozen. Yep, you heard that right. While most people just saw a lighthearted kids musical, Gaum saw real scientific potential in exactly how they animated the snow falling down a CGI mountain. He actually traveled to Hollywood, got permission to use that exact snow animation code, and teamed up with fellow researcher Alexander Puzrin to adapt it to crack this cold case. Section 4. Simulating the unthinkable. Now, what's really interesting about this is the specific mechanism they modeled. We are not talking about a giant wall of loose, fluffy snow. It was a rare slab avalanche. As we can see here, this is a sheet of hard, incredibly dense snow sliding down a slope in large chunks. It's deadly, it's fast-moving, and most importantly for our case, it leaves far less physical evidence behind than a dramatic loose snowslide. But how did a slab avalanche happen on such a shallow slope? Well, the answer was literally right underneath them. The base layer of snow beneath their camp was something called depth hoar, or sugar snow. These are large, greeny snow crystals that simply don't stick together well at all. The hikers had dug down a couple feet into the snowpack to pitch their tent to stay out of the wind. By doing that, they placed their shelter directly on top of this inherently unstable foundation, essentially creating the absolute perfect recipe for a structural failure. Okay, but we still have that 9-hour delay problem to solve. There was no new snowfall recorded in the area that night. So what triggered the slide so much later? Enter the katabatic wind. These are fast-moving downward gusts propelled by gravity. Throughout the night, this completely unseen trigger was slowly transporting immense amounts of snow, just quietly building up mass and pressure directly over that destabilized tent site. Let's move to how this builds into a really concrete, scientifically sound 3-step timeline. Step 1, the hikers dig into the snowpack, accidentally destabilizing that sugar snow base layer. Step 2, the katabatic winds spend the next 9 hours depositing an extra, super heavy load of snow right above them. And step 3,
the weight finally crosses the threshold, and that unstable layer completely gives way, triggering a massive, hard-packed slab avalanche. So, this brilliantly illustrates the physics of the slope failure. It makes sense. But it still leaves us with the most morbid anomaly of the entire investigation. If it was an avalanche, why on earth did the doctor who originally examined the bodies compare their severe chest trauma and fractured skulls to car crash victims, rather than typical avalanche suffocation? To answer this, Game and Puzerin took their adapted snow physics simulation and actually compared it with data from the 1970s, specifically General Motors cadaver crash tests. I know, it sounds wild, but they proved that a sudden, 16-foot block of hard ice, which is roughly the size of a modern SUV, sliding down the slope could strike the hikers while they slept flat on their backs. The simulation confirmed this ice block was heavy enough to violently shatter bones, but wouldn't necessarily cause instant death. And this perfectly explains how the severely injured victims were actually able to flee the camp, likely with the help of their luckier, uninjured tent mates, before eventually succumbing to the damage.
Section 5. Solving the final anomalies.
All right, let's methodically shut down those final, distracting red herrings using basic biology and environmental science. Missing eyes and a tongue? Look, the bodies were out in the harsh wilderness for months. Soft tissue is simply easy pickings for natural scavengers. The strange orangish skin coloration, that's a natural result of mummification from prolonged exposure to the elements. And what about that famous radioactive clothing that everyone talks about? Well, researchers note that thorium in the camping gas lanterns they brought, or simply trace amounts of radiation from the bodies laying in direct high-altitude sunlight for months, easily explains it. No secret weapons, and for sure, no aliens required. Ultimately, the Gaume and Puzerin avalanche model is a massive scientific triumph. It clears away decades of noise and tells us exactly the physical mechanisms of the tragedy based on slope failure studies. But it doesn't attempt to explain the agonizing hours between the avalanche striking the tent and their tragic deaths in the freezing dark. What exactly were those final, desperate moments like as they carried their shattered friends down the mountain into the forest? While this explainer shows us that rigorous scientific method and review can combat decades of misinformation, that profound human element, lost to the howling wind, is a terrifying part of the story that science perhaps will never be able to fully answer.